Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Poltergeist, Indiana Jones, The Goonies, Star Wars. Imagine if you were the authors Steven Spielberg and George Lucas invited to write the novelizations of four of the biggest film blockbuster franchises of the 1980s. Sounds like a scene out of one of those movies, and that's how Dr. James Kahn felt in 1981 when he met Steven Spielberg on the set of E.T. as a member of the hazmat medical team reviving America's favorite alien. Taking the opportunity to slip Spielberg a copy of his debut science fiction novel, World Enough in Time, to check out. Over the rest of the 1980s, Kahn's work would become the first millions of young grade school children, like myself, got excited about reading, as he brought Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader to life in the novelization of Return of the Jedi, recreated Carol Ann's point of view from inside the television in Poltergeist Part 1, which People magazine called spine-tingling, with 520,000 copies in print, and its sequel, Part 2, The Other Side. And next put Indiana Jones' signature hat, brown leather jacket, and bullwhip on when he turned Temple of Doom into a best-selling book. Then in the mid-1980s, took America's favorite gang of kids, the Goonies, on the hunt for One-Eyed Willie's pirate ship treasure with the Fratellis in pursuit in the smash hit novelization of the film. Even visiting the actual pirate ship set and meeting the pirate One-Eyed Willie face-to-face as he wrote. Kahn's catalog features original works like the New World series, featuring the aforementioned World Enough in Time, Time's Dark Laughter and Timefall, and standalone hit The Echo Vector. Kahn spent the 1990s era of his career writing and producing the hit show Melrose Place and working on Star Trek Voyager, before turning in the millennium to focus full-time on his career as a songwriter and recording artist, with albums like Waterline, Roadhouse Full of Blues, and By the Rising of the Sea most recently, along with releasing his first new book in years in 2020 with Matamoros. He's here today to share the behind-the-scenes story of it all. James Kahn, you're a legend. It is such an honor to have you on the show. Thank you for being here. I remember myself going back to the 1980s, being a kid growing up in second and third grade reading your books. And every time a new one came out, I'd, like so many kids from my school, be down at the local Five and Dime down the street from Captain Elementary to buy a new Star Wars or Indiana Jones or Poltergeist book. Going back to your own childhood, what first got you fired up about reading as a kid?
I had reason to talk about this recently with someone else, but I have a very clear memory of being, I must have been around 3 or 4 years old, probably 4, and my parents got a record, a 78 vinyl record of Peter and the Wolf, narrated by Basil Rathbone and I can't remember who the orchestra was, Prokofiev. I can't remember the specifics of the music, but I remember being in love with that record. And it was very brief. It was 20 minutes long, and it was Rathbone narrating and saying, hello, this is a story of Peter and the Wolf, and Peter will be played by the clarinet. And then you hear the clarinet playing a little bit. And then the cat was someone else, and the wolf was the horns, or the hunter was the horns. Anyway, I was in love with that album. And on the flip side was Treasure Island, also about 20 minutes, very abbreviated, as you can imagine, with a narrator, might have been Basil Rathbone again, telling the story, and then with very brief scenes, key scenes of the pirate getting killed in the very beginning, and Jim Hawkins hiding in the apple barrel and overhearing about the mutiny. But both those affected me very deeply, both on a storytelling level and a musical level.
Did you grow up like many of your peers we talked to doing fan fiction of comics you were reading when you started doing writing of your own?
Actually, my first writing, I was about 8 or 9. We moved to the suburbs when I was about 7. And I can remember being in love with comic books, both Superman, Batman, DC comics, but also Tales from the Crypt, Amazing Stories, sort of horror and fantasy comic books. I just ate that stuff up. But I always, or not always, but frequently thought of twists in the story that wasn't in the comic book that I wanted to see, that I thought it would have a better ending if they did this. So I can remember rewriting those comic book stories out in my little 9-year-old cursive scrawl in my notebook, rewriting the whole story with my additions to it. So that was my first writing experience. But that reminds me, going back to 7th grade, maybe one of the biggest influences on my writing was my English teacher in 7th grade. His name was Matthew Meisterheim. who I still exchange emails with on occasion. And it was exactly the same experience. We were doing a social studies or English piece around Thanksgiving and had to write some essay on the Pilgrims. And I said, can I write a short story instead? And he said, sure, go ahead. So I wrote a very, very short story. It was like 4 pages. And he gave me a B plus because he said it was, oh no, I didn't ask him. That's right. I just did it. I just wrote the story. So he gave me a B plus. He said he would have given me an A plus if this had been the assignment. It was so good, but it was so off what he had assigned. He couldn't in good conscience give me an A. So he was the first really supportive teacher I had to encourage my writing.
Once you started playing guitar, did that lead you to begin writing your own lyrics? It's such another important early access point creatively when kids begin playing with words in their own way.
Actually, I started playing the violin at my parents' pressure when I was, I don't know, in 6th or 7th grade. And that lasted a couple years. I was never very good. I think I played 7th seat in the 6th grade orchestra, so you can imagine how good I was. And I stopped that after a couple of years just because it was not working and took up the guitar at that point. So I was probably 13 or 14. And I did not write music then. I was just madly in love with folk music and the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary. And I used to listen to, I lived in Chicago, and I listened to a show called The Midnight Special on WFMT, which is primarily a classical music station in Chicago. But Saturday nights, it was all folk music and really proto-folk music of the kind that we're talking about, of pop folk music. It was the Weavers and Leadbelly and some Harry Belafonte and Odetta and Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie. These are all the people that sort of were the bedrock of what I remember one WAG pop DJ called the Great Folk Music Scare of the early 60s. But I was in love with all that stuff.
You were an actual member of the anti-war movement when you were attending the University of Chicago back in the late 60s. That must have made quite an impression on you. Any professors during those years that did as well?
I was always, a great lover of reading, fiction reading primarily, and I did a lot of humanities and English courses in college as well. But my main education during those years was in radical politics and anti-war and civil rights and demonstrations. And remember, we took over the administration building in 1966. It was all power to the people. And the Chicago riots, I expected when I went down there just to be another mass demonstration. And I was as shocked as anybody to see how out of hand it got so quickly, and scared too. It was kind of a freaky experience and very impactful. My biggest influence as a teacher then was a guy named Jerome McGann in the English department at the University of Chicago. And he taught a class called The Literature of Excess, Romanticism, Fantasy, and Surrealism. And when it came time to do a paper for the class, actually, this is interesting. I'm just realizing this now for the first time. This is a recurrent theme. When it was time to do an essay about one of the writers that we had read, I found essay writing kind of boring, and I asked if I could write a short story in the sort of gestalt of that class, and he said, sure. And that's the first short story I can remember writing. And it was kind of a fantasy time loop kind of story.
It was during your final year at the University of Chicago that you saw your first short story get published. And in Playboy, of all places, After the Box won second place in the university writing contest back in 1971. Please do tell viewers about that early placement.
The story of the box was based on a true story, which is I had a cousin who was working as a mailman as a summer job in Chicago. And as he was on the corner opening the corner mailbox to retrieve all the letters people had put in, some guys walked by and said, "Hey, there's Uncle Sam. You think Uncle Sam lives in that box? Let's take him home and put him back in the box." So he was momentarily afraid they were going to grab him and stuff him in the mailbox. But they were just joking, and they walked on. But he told me that story, and I thought, gee, I wonder what would have happened if they had put it in the mailbox. So I wrote this short story about that this mailman gets stuff, and sort of just what's going through his mind and what he does while he's in the mailbox, either calling or waiting for help. And just as I was doing that, I noticed there was a short story contest at the university, so I just entered it on a whim, and it didn't win first prize; it won second prize, for which I got a little sheet of paper saying you won second prize. But the one of the judges liked it so much and thought it would be just right as a story for Playboy. He sent it to a friend of his, Roby Macaulay, who was the fiction editor at Playboy at that time. And the first, I didn't know that he had sent it. And the first I knew about it was I got a check in the mail one day for $3,000 saying, we've accepted your story. And I was stunned. I couldn't figure out what happened. So I called Playboy and asked how they even got the story. And they told me.
Now, before you became a best-selling science fiction and horror author, you were already working as an emergency room medical doctor, which would ironically lead to your big foot in the door into the book business. Let's take fans back to the start of your fascinating story, the day you got the call out of the blue from Steven Spielberg's people while you were working in the ER.
I was actually one of the people who created the emergency medicine residency at UCLA. I started out going west to do the residency at USC, County Hospital. And after finishing the first year there, 4 of us who were first year residents were secretly approached by faculty at UCLA saying they wanted to form their own emergency medicine residency. They're proposing that we leave the LA County residency, take a year off, and during that year help them create the UCLA residency. Then at the end of that year, we would become the second year residents at the UCLA residency, teaching the first year residents. So that's what we did. One of the reasons I chose emergency medicine as a specialty, my internship had been in internal medicine. And that's, primary care, and you're on all day, and then you have to get up at night, you're on call. And that's like a very hugely demanding job. My father was an internist, so I knew that from the inside. His office was in the basement of our house. So he worked seeing patients in our house until 8:00 at night. And then he made house calls too. And, the phone would ring in the middle of the night and you'd get up and make a house call. So I didn't want to do that. Emergency medicine was not yet officially even a specialty when I decided to go into it. There were only 3 residencies in the country. And I think Albert Einstein, University of Chicago, and LA County. And the head of the AM, there's a lot of pressure against emergency medicine becoming a specialty. The head of the AMA said, emergency medicine is not a specialty, it's a lifestyle. And while he was wrong about it not being a specialty, and it's critical for people to have specialty training in that before they work in an emergency room, he was right that it was a lifestyle, because I, like a lot of people who went into it, wanted a life away from medicine as well as a life in medicine. And one of the crucial things about emergency medicine is you can schedule yourself off as much as you want, and then schedule yourself off for a couple of weeks. So I would do, 3 16-hour shifts a week, for example, and then take a week off. And the days that I wasn't working, I could write. The week that I wasn't working, I could write. And it was designed for people like me.
Now, your first published book actually came out before that, way back in 1979, with World Enough in Time, the first of your New World series, which also featured sequels, Time's Dark Laughter and Time Fall. Please walk fans back through the creation of this early trilogy.
I had the whole idea in mind from the beginning as 3 books. The premise for the whole series, and for the first books certainly, is kind of a medical one. It's we wake up and start out in what seems like a fantasy world of people living alongside mythological creatures, centaurs and minotaurs and vampires, and it seems like a fantasy novel. But what we come to learn is that it's actually 100 or 200 years in our future, and in the intervening years, our genetic engineering capabilities have become so good that we could splice the genes of a bull and a human and create a minotaur. And that happened for many years, and they were done to create armies of centaurs and theme parks and zoos and personal pets, and they became very widespread. And then an apocalypse of some kind intervened, and now we're living in a world where most or many, or if not most, humans have been killed, and the world is ruled by these imaginary beasts. So it's as if our dreams have become our nightmares. Intellectually, the last one, Timefall, is my favorite. Emotionally, I love the first one just because that was, for me, the creation of that whole world, and I loved those characters. This is something of a spoiler, but the first two books seem like, as I said, they're in our future, a couple years in our future, a very primitive world it's dystopian, it's been post-apocalyptic, and it's ruled by mythological creatures. In the third book, we find that it starts in our present day world with an archaeologist who discovers relics of the world of the first two books. And it turns out those were actually in our far distant past. And it's all, again, all about time loops, which is a recurring interest of mine.
Your breakout moment as a best-selling author would come next with just one book under your belt, courtesy of one of those fantastic happy Hollywood accidents on the set of E.T. of all places, where People magazine broke the news at the time that Kahn, writing 16 hours a day in longhand in the MGM offices, produced a spine-tingling tale in 25 days. Talk about pressure. Please take us back inside that crazed creative pace that you had to keep up during this make-or-break first writing assignment.
It's an entertaining story. I had actually written my first science fiction novel before this happened. This was World Enough and Time. It had just been published by Del Rey, by Judy Lynn Del Rey, who was the editor there then. She and I became good friends because she was based in New York, but she came out to LA to do some writer kind of stuff. And I had a meeting with her. This was now while I was working in the emergency room at St. John's in Santa Monica. And she called and said she was so sorry she had to call off the interview to talk about my book that she had just bought because she had developed a bad nosebleed. So I said, no problem. And I got a friend to cover a couple hours of my shift. And I went down to see her at the Beverly Hills Hotel where she was staying. And I brought my equipment with me and my pads and my forceps and my lights and stopped her nosebleed in her hotel room. So we were always good friends after that. Anyway, that was a prior story. The next thing that happened in that emergency room was we got a call from a woman asking if there's anyone down in the ER who could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. So I didn't take that call. The desk clerk took it, and she handed it off to another ER doc down there, Bob Murphy. And he said, sure, we can do that. Come on down and we'll show you how. So he pulled me into it and Alex Lamponi, who ran the emergency room at St. John's. And they came down. It was Kathleen Kennedy, who was the producer of E.T., and Melissa Matheson, who wrote it. And we gave them a demonstration of how we would resuscitate an alien, and they liked our demonstration. So they said, come on down to the set, you'll be in the scene. So the three of us and a number of nurses from the ER there all went down to Laird Studios where they were shooting E.T. It's a small offshoot of MGM Studios. And they dressed us up in hazmat suits, and we were the extras in E.T.'s resuscitation. And we did all the ad-lib dialogue of that scene. They didn't want to write that. They wanted us just to shout out whatever we would say during a real resuscitation. So I got to pound on E.T.'s chest, and if you blink for a nanosecond, you'll miss me. But when the alarm goes off in that scene because E.T.'s heart has stopped, 5 of us run in, and I'm the last doctor holding a clipboard because I'm going to be writing down notes of the CPR. Anyway, it was great fun, and we had a great time. And at the end of the first day, I just got all my nerve together. I was just terrified to do this, but I knew I would never have another chance like this. But I cornered Spielberg in the office with a copy of World Enough and Time of my book. And I said, this must happen to you all the time. I'm sorry if I'm being too forward, but I wrote this novel. It was just published by Del Rey. Would you consider reading it and making a movie out of it? So right. He was very gracious and said, I'll take it home and put it on my shelf and get to it when I have a chance. And, I sort of knew what that meant, but okay. He was being very nice about it. And I felt like proud of myself for having the guts to do that. And then the next day, PA during filming, I was all in my hazmat suit again. PA ran up and said, Mr. Spielberg wants to see you. I was, scared that I had done something wrong during the previous take. And I went in to see him, and he said, well, I read the first chapter of your book, and I really liked it. And I said, so you want to make a movie? And he said, no, but I'm just wrapping Poltergeist at the other end of the lot. But he said, if I need someone to do the novelization in a hurry. We had some issues with the last Novelizer, and we're in a tight time crunch. So we need it done in a month. If you can promise me that you can finish writing the novelization in a month, you got the job. So I said, I didn't know if I could. I hardly knew what a novelization was at that point. And I knew I was scheduled to work all month in the ER, but I said yes on the spot. I could do it. So I got all my friends to cover my shifts for me in the ER. And I spent the next 28 days in his office on MGM.
Poltergeist thereafter became one of the most legendary horror films of all time and scared the bejesus out of America in the theaters. And your book then recreated both that sense of fear and its supernatural sources brilliantly on the page. From the initial suburban sense of safety to what HorrorNovelReviews.com warned is easily one of the most terrifying haunted house stories to ever be told. Be it film or novel, it's one paralyzing event after the other. Did you ever find yourself getting scared when you wrote this story? And what kind of visual aids from the set, say dailies or stills, were you working with alongside the script itself?
I had a copy of the script. It was close to a final shooting script, but I think not the final shooting script. And I used that basically as an outline, as a skeleton plot outline. So I know, this happens and this happens and this happens. I used some of the dialogue from the movie. Some of the dialogue I didn't care for, so I used my own dialogue. And whenever I write, whether it's my own book or a novelization, my first draft is basically a skeleton draft anyway. It's pretty much kind of just the plot line of the story. What happens, who comes into the room, they have a talk about this, and it's very, very pared down. And once I have that, then I use that as the sort of basis for going back and really fleshing it out and developing it with character motivation and backstory and internal monologue and relationships. So I didn't have any dailies, but I had production stills. So they gave me the script and a lot of stills so I could see what the creature looked like. I could see what the house looked like when I described it and things like that. It took me about 2 weeks to write that. And Frank Marshall was at that point my go-between to Steven. Spielberg was so wrapped up with being on the set when shooting E.T. still, he didn't have a lot of time to spend with me. But Frank had sort of more free time, at least time to spend with me. So I gave them the first draft, and he read it that night really quickly, and Spielberg read some of it and relied on Frank's assessment. And they said, it's great. Go ahead and do a second draft now. And I said, well, for the second draft, I'm wondering if I can bring in anything else that I want to. There were a lot of other ideas that it had brought up for me because I had done ESP research in medical school. So I wanted to bring some of that research in, some of those ideas, and give them to the researchers in the movie, and develop other aspects of the relationships and the characters as well. And I had thought of additional scenes that weren't in the movie that just came to me that I thought this would be a really cool scene. So he said, sure, go for it. Do whatever you want. We like the first draft so well. We trust you now, and go ahead and do that. So I did.
Carol Ann getting sucked into that TV is perhaps the most frightening section of the film and book, for both the parents who were watching and their kids. I wanted to ask you this for decades and finally have the chance. What did it feel like to write from Carol Ann's perspective inside the television?
Two parts to that. One is, as I say, I had done ESP research, so in terms of the scientific and intellectual foundation of it, that was all there, and I drew from aspects of my research. For the other, it's just a matter of diving down into my fantasy life, which is very rich, and even some of my reasons for going into emergency medicine was its wizard-like aspects. That I felt like a sorcerer. That people were dead, and I could actually pull them back from death. It was a very potent and magical kind of aspect to medicine. People talk about the laying on of hands as a big part of medicine, of the healing aspects of medicine that are not simply related to drugs and high tech kinds of things. And an extension of the laying on of hands is this sorcerer like aspect. So a lot of my internal life has been lived in the fantasy world anyway, and it wasn't that difficult for me to dive down into it. And in fact, there were times when I was writing when I really just scared the bejesus out of myself in the writing of it. And on occasion would have to stop and stand up and kind of walk off the willies. It was in Spielberg's conference room at MGM, and the room was surrounded by old school video games, console video games. So whenever I was either having some kind of writer's block or really scared, I would get up and play Missile Command. I was an early television acolyte. The birth of television happened around my birth. So I can remember being, 5 or 6 years old and sitting in front of the television, just like Carol Ann, and staring at those shows. And then even staring at, in those days, shows went until 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And then it was just static. It was the symbol, I can't remember what it was called anymore, of that station. This is the station of CBS or whatever it was, over just static. Or sometimes it was just, and I remember just sitting there and staring at that static, just like Carol Ann. So it really drew me back to my own sort of fascination and obsession with television. For some reason, I'm able to step into those. I think it goes back to my those amazing stories and tales from the crypt comic books. Actually, and I would get so deeply involved in that headspace that just took it with me.
Turning to one of your specialties, the creative freedom you found within the novelization process to make the book your own. As Pop Matters pointed out years later, Kahn's version of Poltergeist is a rare example of a book written after a movie is released, which results in a riveting read. The book has the same premise as the movie, but Kahn adds some wonderfully creepy accompaniments. These scenes add wonderful dimension to what we already have in the film. What were a few of your personal favorites from among the new places you took readers on the page beyond what they'd first seen on the silver screen?
Two scenes actually are related to very strange poltergeist experiences I had while I was there. One was a scene, I've always been afraid of spiders, so I wanted to add a spider scene to Poltergeist. So it was a scene where the young male research assistant, I can't remember his name anymore, was in the kitchen in the middle of the night getting a snack, and suddenly finds himself frozen in place, standing in the kitchen. He can't move. And he sees an army of spiders slowly crawling across the floor towards him. And so it's what's going through his mind. And he sees, all he can do is move his eyes, and he sees them, and they start crawling up inside his pants leg, and they get up and go into his ear and his nose, and they lay eggs in his throat. And it was so scary. It's one that I had to at the end of it. And the insane thing that happened related to that scene was after I had turned in the novel and was already going to publication, I brought the typed up drafts, which is all I had, to a good friend of mine, just asking him to read just that scene in the novel to tell me if it scared him as much as it scared me in the writing of it, the spider scene. So he was sitting on his couch and he had the manuscript open and he was reading it. And he was thinking, it's pretty scary. And all of a sudden, as he's reading, on that page, a spider drops down from the ceiling and he smashes it shut. And I still have that manuscript now with a squashed spider on the page where the spider is crawling into his mouth.
Spielberg and company were so happy with the performance of the first novelization, which sold over 500,000 copies, that they next handed you the reins to write the sequel. Did you find that task any easier when you sat down to write Poltergeist 2, The Other Side?
Yeah, I did not have dailies. I had production stills. And it was a little bit less, I was a little bit less into it in terms of feeling like I was right there. I was a little more removed for that one. It was more of a technical exercise than a real self-exploration.
That's probably because your imagination had the competition of just coming off stepping into the boots, signature leather jacket, hat, and bullwhip that came with writing Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom that Steven Spielberg and producing partner George Lucas gave you to run wild with on the page.
I always just imagine myself in that role. It's like when I'm writing that, I am Indiana Jones. And I write very visually, particularly the action scenes, very visually, and they're very quickly paced. And certainly on the first draft, I write like that. On the second draft, then after I've written just the things that happen sequentially in order, then I go back and I try and I feel how would I be feeling, when a boulder is rolling down at me and I stick in those momentary sort of internal feelings that you don't have in a movie. That was great. That again, Spielberg is a genius, and I remember seeing The Raiders of the Lost Ark for its opening night at the Grauman's Chinese Theater. It might have been Mann's Chinese Theater by that time, but I can just remember that first moment when you see Harrison Ford's head going through the jungle and he hears a click behind him and he turns his head and he brings his whip out and it took me right back to, again, early television. There's a cowboy called Lash LaRue and some of the early Zorro characters used whips. And it was there's something so romantic and primal about that. I fell in love with it from that moment. I did write actually I think it was a whole new chapter that wasn't in the movie. That was about Short Round, who I thought got a little short shrift in the movie. And anyway, I kind of wanted to see who was this kid who hooks up with Indy. So I wrote a whole chapter about his backstory, about how he got to be the kid that he was and what his life was like up to the moment that he ran into Indiana Jones. I call the chapter, I like titling chapters. I titled the chapter A Boy's Life because it was about this boy, Short Round, but it was also a secret, it was an Easter egg. It was a secret homage to Spielberg because the working title of E.T. was A Boy's Life. Partly because it's kind of a boring title in a way, and they didn't want people to know it was a big Spielberg production about aliens and all that. So, but I believe it's also, he called it that because it was about himself, Spielberg did. It was about his own boy's life growing up. And there's a very autobiographical aspect, I think, at least in metaphorical terms, to how Spielberg grew up. You could imagine it, having gone through what Elliot went through in that movie.
What about stepping into the role of antagonist, Mola Ram?
Once again, I think that goes back to Tales from the Crypt. I was always a great lover of not only those kinds of comic books, but early horror films, sort of Vincent Price and Ealing Studios British horror films, black and white horror films. There's one called Bloody. I can't remember the title of it, but it involved vampires and bloody things like ripping hearts out, jamming stakes into hearts. And it was, I had a very sweet, mild suburban growing up. And this was my way of escaping into a whole different world.
You had an original fiction title which hit stores during this era of your career, The Echo Vector. What a cool title. Please tell us what you most enjoyed about writing a medical thriller as a break from the novelizations.
And start out in what seems like a fantasy world of people living alongside mythological creatures, centaurs, minotaurs, and vampires, and and it seems like a fantasy novel. But what we come to learn is that it's actually 100 or 200 years in our future. And in the intervening years, our genetic engineering capabilities have become so good that we could splice the genes of a bull and a human and create a minotaur. And that happened for many years, and they were done to create armies of centaurs and theme parks and zoos and personal pets, and they became very widespread. And then an apocalypse of some kind intervened, and now we're living in a world where most or many, or if not most, humans have been killed, and the world is ruled by these imaginary beasts. So it's as if our dreams have become our nightmares. Yeah, intellectually, the last one, Timefall, is my favorite. Emotionally, I love the first one just because that was, for me, the creation of that whole world, and I loved those characters. This is something of a spoiler, but the first two books seem like, as I said, they're in our future, a couple years in our future, a very primitive world it's dystopian, it's been post-apocalyptic, and it's ruled by mythological creatures. In the third book, we find that it starts in our present-day world with an archaeologist who discovers relics of the world of the first two books. And it turns out those were actually in our far distant past. And it's all, again, all about time loops, which is a recurring interest of mine. Sure, it's an entertaining story. I had actually written my first science fiction novel before this happened. This was World Enough and Time. It had just been published by Del Rey, by Judy Lynn Del Rey, who was the editor there then. She and I became good friends because she was based in New York, but she came out to LA to do some writer kind of stuff. And I had a meeting with her. This was now while I was working in the emergency room at St. John's in Santa Monica. And she called and said she was so sorry she had to call off the interview to talk about my book that she had just bought because she had developed a bad nosebleed. So I said, no problem. And I got a friend to cover a couple hours of my shift. And I went down to see her at the Beverly Hills Hotel where she was staying. And I brought my equipment with me and my pads and my forceps and my lights and stopped her nosebleed in her hotel room. So we were always good friends after that. Anyway, that was a prior story. The next thing that happened in that emergency room was we got a call from a woman asking if there's anyone down in the ER who could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. So I didn't take that call. The desk clerk took it, and she handed it off to another ER doc down there, Bob Murphy. And he said, sure, we can do that.
Comic book resources with over 60 million users recently noted that in 1978, Star Wars brought audiences into a world unlike any other at the time. The arrival of the pulp science fiction world from the years of Flash Gordon seemed like a whole new horizon. This world came with so much detail and world building that there was simply too much to cover in a single film. Thankfully, the novels were there to give us some much needed insight into the design of various ships and machines that gave the Star Wars setting a lived-in feel. Presenting the Star Wars stories in a new format with different writers behind them opened the door for different writers to undertake the stories in the future and even write originals. As famous as the films became, once they were gone, that was it. It was the novels that allowed fans to relive their favorite moments on repeat. James Cahn's 1983 novelization of Return of the Jedi gave us specific details that we would have missed otherwise, granting scenes so much more worth. The release of the original trilogy of novels showed that the Star Wars setting could be used for more than family-friendly space opera, and provided a whole new foundation for the writers to work from. The realization of Star Wars as a written medium created an entire trend of expanded media that still runs today. Please take the generations of writers you influenced back to the moment when George Lucas first called offering you this gig.
Again, just like the Indiana Jones, I remember going to opening night, the midnight show, except it was, I think, like 10 o'clock at night for the very first Star Wars at the Chinese theater. Long line, way longer than I expected. So the seats were almost full by the time I got in. I had to take like a third row seat. So I was looking almost straight up at the screen when, this Star Cruiser comes literally over my head, passing over my head. And I was just like dumbfounded, and I was hooked from that moment on. So yeah, it was a huge deal for me. And to get the call that I had been picked to write the third one was unbelievable. And that was, because Spielberg liked my job with Poltergeist so well. When it was time for Lucas to start looking for novelizers, one of the people he called was Spielberg and said, you have anybody you like? So I got recommended that way. And then in addition, the Star Wars novelizations were published by Del Rey. So Judy Lynn Del Rey was also a big fan of mine from my own World Enough and Time series. So she seconded the motion, so I got picked.
Science fiction fans around the world would love to hear about your specific method for bringing the Force to life on the page.
Well, again, it's going inside it and trying to feel, what does the Force feel like? It's there's certainly a Zen kind of aspect to it on a philosophical level. I've never been a very good meditator myself, although I've tried, but I tried to get into that headspace again, and sort of feel like, what is. I have been hypnotized, which is similar to meditation. I was a hypnotist as well. I hypnotized people in my ESP research that I did in medical school, and as part of the training to be a hypnotist, you get hypnotized as well. So I was able to get into that space, and it creates a feeling of a kind of loss of boundaries between self and the rest of the universe. And I tried to find a way to describe that.
What about stepping into the being of Luke Skywalker with everything he himself had to face heading into this legendary lightsaber rematch between he and Darth Vader near the end of the movie?
Yeah, specific things like that, I would definitely use the script as the basis. And then if additional things occurred to me, either sound elements sometimes. Again, it's the kind of thing where I think I drew on my own psychology, my own relationship to my father. I love my father, but he was a very controlling guy in some ways. There were times when there's a lot of friction between us, ways I saw that I was like him that made me angry. I don't want to be like him, but at the same time, things that I could see in myself that was like him that I was very proud of and glad I was like him, but then guilty because I wanted to be my own person. So you learn to draw on all those. The more you can draw on your own personal feeling and experience and put that on the page, the better you can do it.
You really gave R2-D2 and Chewbacca some additional dimensions within the book, translating the droid sounds into descriptions the reader could appreciate like it was human. Was that originally your idea?
One of the things I did in terms of sound, I'm thinking now that some fans actually were not happy with, was to try and recreate the language of the Wookiees and of R2-D2. And I wrote that out the way it sounded to me. I tried to transliterate the exact sounds. And some fans wrote and they loved that about it. And some said, how could you try and, these are so wonderful, irreproducible sounds. It's a shame on you for trying to get it on paper. Same thing. It's all very difficult. But I would always close my eyes and just write it down letter by letter, matching the sound of the letter if I could. And then I would capitalize or lowercase depending on emphasis in a speech. Sometimes I would actually watch a scene where they were speaking these are the Wookiees. I didn't have anything like that for Ewoks because they weren't on screen yet.
What about translating the way that Ewoks talked on the page?
Well, they were very teddy bear-like characters. It was, and as I say, I got production stills of them so I could see them. They look like teddy bears. So I tried to give them that personality. And
now, for diehard fans that might already know, this film was originally titled Revenge of the Jedi before it was retitled by the studio Return of the Jedi. And there's a key scene at the end of the film that was rumored to have been similarly changed at the last minute in terms of who killed the Emperor. How did that affect your work on the book when you reached that moment in the story and script?
Yeah, as opposed to Darth Vader, who I tried throughout the book to give little hints about his essential humanity inside, which finally came out at the end. I wanted to make Vader, as portrayed, really a pure evil force. I made the Emperor, excuse me. I wanted to make the Emperor a pure evil force. So it was maybe it goes back to my first imaginings of Tobor the robot in Captain Video, or sharks or creatures or things that you cannot reason with. It's not like you can give them a reason why they shouldn't do this bad thing. They are just pure evil, and they love. If there's any emotion tied to them at all, it's that they love doing things that are evil just for evil's sake. And so it was. There's a kind of fun to getting into that kind of mindset. You don't have to moderate it with any kinds of deeper psychology. Actually, that's a story that I don't think anybody else knows about. You get to break it, which is in the script that I was given. Darth Vader doesn't throw him down the shaft. Luke throws him down the shaft, and that's how I wrote the novelization. With Luke throwing him down the shaft. And when I got the galley proofs back, that had been changed. So that's just literally one line was changed. They made it Darth Vader instead of Luke. So when later on, I went up to Skywalker Ranch. I think it was might have been like the 4th of July party, or maybe it was a wrap party for the movie. And I saw George, and I brought that up to him. I said, did you have a last minute change of heart, or did you know all along you were going to change that? And did you give me a false copy in case it was leaked? Did everyone who saw the script was given a little bit different idea of what was going on, so that if something leaked, you would know who leaked it? Or did you know that all the time? And he just smiled at me and walked on.
ComicBookResources.com would focus on the same cover story, the spotlight specifically on the iconic scene you gave us of Darth Vader's passing, but from a different perspective. It's sections such as these that make the novels worth reading, as they can recontextualize scenes we already know and make them far more impactful than they could have been on film. Please take Star Wars fans around the world inside the writing of one of the most dramatic and climactic scenes of the whole series, and certainly of the book and film.
In the movie, it took up very little screen time, actually. When I went back and saw the movie, between the time that Luke takes off Darth's helmet and they have a few exchange of words, but that felt like such an important moment to me, and a moment where they both needed to really relive their pasts together and reconcile in a very human way. So it was. I wanted to imbue it with grief and guilt and shame and pride and all those things that you would go through on the way to finally having a reconciliation with a parent. The way we all of us have, I think, sort of mixed relationships with father-son kinds of things, and love, but also there's friction and so I wanted to, I pulled on my own experiences. Not that my father was anything like Darth Vader, but just any kind of psychological resonance with that I had myself, I used. He was Darth Vader, but I put in hints all through the novel that there was something more inside him. Even at the very beginning, in the first few pages of the novel, when Vader senses that his son is near. There's a line about his breath quickened. Well, we all know that Darth Vader's breath doesn't quicken, just mechanically in and out and in and out. But I wanted to give a sense that there was still a human being inside there. There was something about him that his emotions could respond to, as machine-like as he was. And so I put little hints and clues throughout to prepare us for the fact that he wasn't just all evil.
What about writing from the perspective of being inside Darth Vader's helmet and being trapped inside that machine of a suit?
I've got a bit of claustrophobia myself, so I drew on that.
For viewers who might not appreciate it, what's the pressure like writing a novelization like this one, knowing that George Lucas is standing right over your shoulder, along with the rest of the Star Wars universe, from the studio to the publisher, as they no doubt had a lot riding on the success of both this film and book?
It was like, not just the usual pressure that you have when writing a book. There's less pressure, actually. Well, it's a different kind of pressure when you're writing your own book than when you're doing a novelization. The pressure when you're doing your own book is sort of self-imposed, and you feel pressure to do a good job because you want everyone to like it. When you're doing a novelization, you're, and especially a novelization like this, you're under a huge amount of external pressure that, man, you better get this right. There's a lot riding on this. People are going to be reading it and comparing you and saying how disappointed they are if you don't get it right. And it was tough.
So going from sitting in the theater 3 rows from the screen years earlier, watching those Imperial starships and Millennium Falcon fly over across the stars, it must have been pretty amazing getting to recreate those spaceships in your own descriptions.
Very, very visually. I'm a very visual writer, and that's exactly for that reason. I close my eyes and I can just see these things happening, and it's almost sometimes like I'm not writing it myself. I'm just channeling what I'm seeing. And it comes out. My favorite aspects are, I've been a science fiction lover my whole life, and drawing back as far as Captain Video and his Video Rangers and Zorro and Treasure Island, up through Fantastic Stories and the black and white horror films of the 50s. It's just been a love of mine, and just being able to draw on all those different things, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, to bring something into what I'm doing now. It's just felt wonderful.
The Chicago Tribune not long ago looked back at the instant success of a marketing niche that once it found its spiritual home in spinning wire racks at drugstores, including the Return of the Jedi novelization from 37 years ago that remains one of James Cahn's high-water marks, reaching #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Recently, another author from a new generation of Star Wars novelizations, millennial writer Ray Carson, who adapted Rise of Skywalker, spoke of the same mesmerized experience I had reading your adaptations as a kid, commenting that I was 10 years old and read Return of the Jedi at a time in my life when I lived in pretty abject poverty. I could not afford to go to the movies, and the book came out a little before the movie. Since I knew we couldn't afford to go to the movie, I begged my mother to get a copy at the library. The writing was smooth, the pacing was great. I read it 3 times before I saw the movie. When you hear your works had that kind of influence on future generations of science fiction authors, it must be gratifying.
And in those days in particular, there were no DVDs and no streaming movies. And after you'd seen the movie in the theater once, or if you could afford it, you maybe saw it twice, there was no way to relive it and re-experience it except through the novelizations.
Talking about another film that became instantly legendary, as ScreenRant.com reported when it was first released back in 1985, The Goonies became etched into the hearts of 80s kids everywhere. After the success of the film upon its release, Warner Brothers took steps to continue to monetize on the movie. In that same year, they reached out to writer James Kahn to create the novelization of the film. So here you are, just when you think your career couldn't get any bigger, you get yet another call from Steven Spielberg with an invitation to novelize an entirely different kind of film. This one being in the more family-friendly arena. How did that initial conversation go?
I just got a call one day that the movie was being filmed. It was getting close to ending production. And if I wanted to do the novelization, it was mine to have. So I said, I looked at who the people were involved. I didn't know Chris Columbus at that time, but I certainly knew Spielberg. And I said, sure, I'm in. So again, they gave me a copy of the script and some production stills so I could see what the kids looked like, what the pirate ship looked like. And I wrote it.
One-Eyed Willie's pirate ship really did mark the ultimate X on the treasure map, so to speak. And talk about a set piece becoming a character itself in the film. Did you actually get to go to that soundstage and walk on the pirate ship while you were in the course of writing the book to get a feel for what it was like to really stand inside it?
My first exposure to both music and narrative was this record of Treasure Island. And ever since then, and then I when I got a little older, I read the novel Treasure Island, and it was and remains one of my favorite novels of all time. And I've had a romance and love of pirates and pirate ships ever since then. So when I discovered this script was also about pirates, it was pure joy to me. And to get to go to the set and be on that pirate ship was also it was great fun. The ship was actually, on a set on the Warner lots in about, 3 feet of standing water at this huge sound stage. So it was 7/8 scale. So it was a pretty big ship. Walked through it and got a lot more sort of physical detail than I could have possibly have appreciated in the, I had production stills too, but they didn't give me the kind of infused sensation of all the visual detail that there was.
Did you get to look at One-Eyed Willie the way that Mikey did in the film?
Again, it was another instance of me feeling like I was inside my own fantasies.
Did you visit, for instance, the town in Astoria, Oregon that the book is filmed in while you were writing?
Fortuitously, I spent every summer of my life growing up from the ages of about, 7 to 18, in a little town in southern Michigan called Union Pier. My grandfather had a quote resort there. It was a collection of about 20 little cottages that he rented out to people for the summer for summer homes, and so the family went up there. I spent me and all my cousins spent every summer there, and it was a little beach town. Basically, it was very much like Astoria. It was sandier. We spent more time at the beach, but it was the same kind of pack of kids running around together everywhere and getting into trouble and looking for things to do and being bored and trying to figure out a way not to be bored.
BrandonandThe80s.com would note of the enhancements that the novelization brought to fans that there's a little more adventure in the Goonies book, with the added compliment that it's a great way to spend a little more time with the gang while getting some new aspects of the adventure along the way. In that spirit, who became a few of your favorite characters from the film to embody on the page? There's so many Goonies here to pick from. Whether we're talking about Mouth or Chunk or Data, or Mikey or Brandon or Andy or Steph.
I intentionally, just before I started writing, reread Huckleberry Finn. And I wanted to give Mikey that voice. I wanted to give the book that sensibility, and I wanted to give Mikey that voice. So I made, like in Huck Finn, I decided to make it first person, to write it first person instead of third person. Most novels are third person, and my others certainly were. But the opening line of the Goonies was, "So my name is Mikey Walsh." It's like this kid, this kid that I remember myself being, is telling you a story. This is the story of what happened to me. He gives it a little bit more sense of this really did happen because he's telling us, and more of a personal sense about it. They were all great characters, and again, it was like there are archetypes that I had echoes of from my own childhood. There are probably a dozen cousins of an age running around together in this little town of Union Pier. And there was one like Chunk and there was one like Mouth. And I just hearkened back to my own childhood.
And of course, everybody loves Sloth. Was he more fun or challenging to write from the headspace of as a character?
I love Sloth, and the mom was fabulous too. It was fun to try to get into the mind of a simple, kind person who'd sort of, had he been raised in a different situation, he would have been a much different person. But his essential kindness was there. And actually in the novel, I added something that wasn't in the movie at the very end. There's just a little newspaper accounting of Sloth being adopted and getting bar mitzvahed by Chuck's family, right?
To really drive the point home of how amazing a process it is to have reimagined these characters in a novelization, in terms of how the Goonies all spoke, joked, and so forth, viewers might be fascinated to know that you hadn't actually seen the movie before you wrote the book, and had to invent your own versions of their personalities in terms of how they'd sound, laugh, and everything.
Exactly. Yeah. None of these movies, never got to see any of these movies before writing the book. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge, and maybe it was a good idea. Maybe it allowed me to expand and create things in their own way that I would have felt locked into had I seen the movie.
Finally, is that scene at the very end of the film when One-Eyed Willie's pirate ship sails itself out to sea one that you would have ended the book on?
I liked it, and it felt very much like what's called in method acting the physicalization of the subtext. That for me, this was like this magical ship that I'd grown up loving, and it's sailing off into the distance, kind of, sort of like the end of my childhood, maybe, or the end of this story. Anyway, it felt very natural and good.
So how in the world do you move from film novelizations to working as a writer-producer on Melrose Place at the height of the show's popularity?
I wrote a spec feature film script early on when I was just finishing my first year of residency at LA County. And it was kind of an ER script, basically about, fictionalized version of what I'd gone through at LA County Emergency Room. So it didn't get bought, but it got a lot of attention from agents and studios. So it got me an agent. And my first agent said, Jay, feature films are a hobby, but television is a career. People who write feature films, they're lucky if they get one made every 6 or 8 years. If what you want is to be a screenwriter, then what you want to do is get into the TV industry. So I took his words to heart, and he started getting me meetings with TV producers and studios, and I started getting work there. I got my first TV job as an in-house writer was for a sitcom called ER, which is a Norman Lear comedy, a 30-minute comedy with Elliot Gould as an ER doctor and Mary McDonald as another one. And I was the junior staff writer. That was back in '83, I think. And that sort of taught me my television writing chops. It started, at least it was a great introduction. It was produced by Saul Turteltaub and Bernie Orenstein, who were great old sort of Borscht Belt comedy writers. They had written for, Sid Caesar and Danny Thomas, and so they had that whole background, and that was their kind of humor, and it was just great working with them. I got a job as a head writer for a 30-minute syndicated show called Family Medical Center. Again, my first shows were all medically related because that was, people in Hollywood are very impressed that I was a doctor. So that's where I got steered. So I wrote 167 shows for Family Medical Center. Some of them I only co-wrote because we had freelancers coming in to pitch ideas, and we would write them together. And that lasted a year, but I really, because we were so under the gun and there were so many, I really learned how to write television on that show. That led to, if I'm right, a broadcast, an NBC show, nighttime show called Medicine Ball. It's another medical one. That only lasted a year, but I made some great connections there, and that was my first experience with a network drama kind of thing. And I wrote 2 scripts for that show, and one of them got some interest from the people on Melrose Place who were looking for a new staff writer. So my agent said, what do you think about working for Melrose Place? I said, that's a soap opera, isn't it? And he said, yeah. I said, I've never watched a soap opera. I wouldn't know, He said, well, writing is writing. Go in and talk to them, at least. So I went in and talked to them, and they had liked my Medicine Ball script. I also had a spec feature script. It was kind of a film noir, insurance fraud, murder, femme fatale thing, and they really loved that. So after I had a good interview meeting, and I went home and my agent called and said, well, they want you. So I went on as a junior writer, which is called a story editor. Television, feature films are a director's medium. Television is really a writer's medium. And shows are run by and created by and everything by the writers. And there's a very standard set way of that happening. You start out as what's called a story editor, where you pitch one story and you get to write your one script in a season. And then if that works out, then the next year you become an executive story editor and then a co-producer. When you're a co-producer, you not only write your scripts, but you are involved in the production of your script. So you help do casting on the script. You do music spotting. You sit down with the people who are doing the score and talk about where music should come in your script. And then after that, the next year you become a producer, and then a supervising producer, and then a co-executive producer, and finally an executive producer. But the shows are, and each time you get elevated a little bit, you get a little more responsibility in producing. So now you're not just doing casting on your own shows, but you're doing casting on the shows of the younger writers who are coming in after you that they wrote.
Fascinating. Now, I, like millions of kids that went to high school in the early 90s and then college in the mid-90s, watched this show. We knew all the characters, from Dr. Michael Mancini and Jane to her sister Sydney, to Jake and Billy and Allison and Matt, and of course Heather Locklear's unforgettable Amanda Woodward. You wrote them all. What were a few of your favorite episodes that you created for these characters to wreak romantic havoc with on screen week in and out?
Actually, I loved the first one I did. It was called Amanda Unplugged. And the opening, actually, I should tell, maybe this story is meaningless unless you're...
Not at all. It's your episode. It's your, yeah.
So when I first got there, as I say, I had never watched a soap opera. I was pretty intimidated by even being there. I didn't know how this worked or how a soap opera worked. So I was pretty quiet the first several meetings. I just kept my ears open and wanted to see how it was done. So the way Melrose Place was done, something called a cold open, where it comes in on a scene between two characters and some conflict that's going on in their relationship, and it ends on a dramatic what's going to happen next note, and then it cuts to commercial and comes back with the credits, and then the show gets going. But in this one particular show that the writer's room was breaking, they did that. But then instead of going from that scene to commercial, they went from that scene to a second scene about a different couple having their own relationship, and then it went to commercial. So I said, so wait, you're doing a bipartite opening on this one? And the producer looked at me. There's a silence in the room. And the producer looked at me and said, he speaks and it's gibberish. So that sort of, it broke the tension a little bit for me anyway. And I felt like everyone laughed, and I felt like I was starting to get into the swing of it. Anyway, my first opening for my unipartite show opening was Amanda is having a huge battle, a physical fight with an ex-husband who she ends up throwing over the railing of this balcony in the house. And then she's sitting by his bedside in the hospital. He's in a coma. He's unconscious. And the nurse says to her, he seems unconscious, but we all believe they can really hear what you're saying. So, very touching. And the nurse leaves, and Amanda takes his hand and gives a long speech about, their history. And I know that we've been through a lot together, but I just want you to understand that after everything that's happened, I really hope you die. and I had such fun writing that, and everyone loved it. And I was complimented by all the people on the set, the crew. They all thought that was just the greatest opening ever, particularly because Michael and Peter were doctors. And so I got to, to kind of stick it to the doctors in my past who I didn't like.
You got revenge on them there.
I got revenge because, there are a lot of wonderful doctors that I've known over the years, but there have been some real jerks too. So I love Sydney. Sydney was actually, I have to say, mine and many people's favorite person to write. She was just so much fun. Well, her sort of ingenuous evil. Sort of, she'd come up with these plots and terrible things to do to people, but so almost like a Billie Holiday kind of wide-eyed. There wasn't any maliciousness to it. Almost, it was just doing what she wanted to do or had to do.
Alternately, for science fiction fans, what was it like writing within the Star Trek universe?
Well, I had just one freelance script in The Next Generation. And that was not a great experience. I pitched the idea. They liked it. I wrote a beat sheet. They asked me to change it a little bit. I changed it a little bit. And then I ultimately, it went through like 15 different writers. They just kept changing and kept changing and kept changing. Just it bore the barest resemblance to what I first came in with. So that was not a happy experience. Getting on Voyager was interesting. I had just written a spec script for the show The Sopranos, which was a favorite show of mine. Still remains one of my favorite shows of all time. And I did a great spec script. It was so great, it got me a huge number of meetings.
Please take viewers inside your latest release, Matamoros.
I wrote a novel after that called Matamoros, which was about a piece of American history nobody knows about. Matamoros was the Mexican town just on the other side of the Rio Grande from Brownsville, Texas. And during the Civil War, it was called the back door of the South because the North had blockaded all the southern ports during the war, but they were not allowed by law to blockade a foreign port. So the South would ship all of its cotton to Brownsville, Texas, ferry it across the river to Matamoros, and then ship it out from Matamoros to England and around the world, and get money to pay for arms that was then shipped in to Matamoros from England and Germany and wherever else. They would come to Matamoros, they would ferry it across the island to Brownsville and ship weapons to the Confederacy. So Matamoros became a kind of Casablanca-like town. It was full of Yankee and Reb spies and gun runners and cotton smugglers, also Texas Rangers, because we had just won Mexico, but there were a lot of Mexicans who wanted to take Texas back still. So there were a lot of Mexican Texas things going on. And also Napoleon III had just invaded Mexico. So there were French Foreign Legionnaires in Matamoros and Austrian infantry. It was sorry, that was my phone just buzzing. So it was a fantastically wild town and a great setting for a kind of spy and smuggling and fighting novel. So I wrote that novel. And then while I was doing the second draft of that novel, I decided to write a CD with each of the songs about one of the characters in the novel. So I did that and came out with Matamoros in 2020, issued them both in 2020.
Now, as a real-life ER doctor, you've taught interns for decades. What kind of tips, on the other hand, would you give aspiring authors who say maybe were students in a similar setting?
I would say write about something you know or love close to your heart initially, because that's what you can speak most about. But as a craft, the thing I can say is all writing is rewriting. When I was a younger writer, I would write something and maybe rewrite it once and think, great, this is finished. I love it. Here it is, world. But what I've come to learn is that it takes endless rewriting. My novel Matamoros, I probably wrote 20 drafts of. Most of certainly my feature film scripts, I've written at least that many drafts. When I was doing television, there was a kind of production train that was never stopped, and you couldn't afford to write that many drafts. But I would still go through 3 or 4 drafts of, significant drafts, and then half a dozen minor drafts after that. So you shouldn't be afraid to rewrite, and in fact, you should want to rewrite. And when people give you notes, that's you should rewrite this, or I didn't like this, or this could be better. You should try and listen to that with no resistance, and just assimilate it and live with those notes, and then take the ones that you feel could be right, and don't be afraid to lose things that you've written before and write new stuff.
Bringing our conversation full circle, we end as we began, with your love of music being your primary passion these days. Please take viewers and fans inside the studio for the making of your solo albums, Waterline, Roadhouse Full of Blues, and By the Rising of the Sea.
You know, as I said, I started playing guitar and folk music as a young high school student, Peter, Paul, Mary, and that kind of thing. And then got into, rock and roll like you do when you're that age. I had a rock and roll band called Lord Kelvin and the Absolute Zeros. We all took turns being absolute zeros. And but then, I got busy with other things and I kept playing guitar for myself, but didn't do much with it. When my kids started getting born, I started writing lullabies for them that I would sing them to sleep with. And that was kind of the beginning of my songwriting career. And then once that happened, I started writing more and more songs that were not lullabies to them, but just kind of in the folk music vein. And then I got to, until I had a whole library of songs, probably 30 songs that I'd written, that I had sung for myself and my family and at cousins' gatherings, but that was all. I was getting bored with my guitar playing when I moved to Santa Barbara. My wife suggested I take guitar lessons. I thought, that's ridiculous. I've been playing since I was a kid. I don't need lessons. So she said, well, what the heck? You'll learn something new. You won't be so bored with your playing anymore. So I started taking lessons from this woman named Kate Wallace, who lives here, who's a singer-songwriter herself. And she asked me if I had written anything. So I sang one of my songs for her, and she was kind of blown away. And she connected me with a friend of hers, David West, who's a musician in town who has a studio in town. And she said she thought I had to record one of them. So I did, and Dave loved my stuff as well. So I started recording with him and eventually developed this whole first folk song album, Waterline, and then just went on from there. I became so in love partly with the process of recording my own music in the studios. It was so much fun. And partly that he would connect me with and get side musicians who were fantastic professional musicians that he had toured with in the past. That just added so much to my music, so much dimension and musicianness to it that it raised it to a new level. It just thrilled me and sparked me to write all kinds of new things.
And that became Roadhouse Full of Blues. And then what else is coming up musically, or what else do you want to?
Actually, I changed the title of Roadhouse Full of Blues to Man Walks Into a Bar. That was a concept album in which every song on the album was about one of the people in this bar on this given night. And then it told the story of each person and then how all of their stories commingled into kind of a meta story that came together at the end. And I've always wanted to do a stage musical out of that. I may do that someday at some point. But about a year ago, my David West, who had been producing my CDs, said, you've written some great Irishy kinds of things, and shanties are becoming popular now. Why don't you write a shanty, but do it about something that I love, which is saving the whales, something that David loves. He's a great whale lover. So I did that, and we liked it, and we thought about what about expanding it to a whole CD of shanties about all kinds of environmental problems that we're facing now. So climate change and pollution and COVID, which has some climate involvement as well. So that's what I did. I wrote a dozen songs about all of those things and just released it this month, actually. It's just come out. And it's already doing very well. It's getting a lot of press, both in the sea shanty world, but also in the environmental world. There are a couple of songs about climate change. And in fact, the title of the CD is By the Rising of the Seas. The title song, The Rising of the Seas, I did a music video of, which has won a number of film festival awards. The song itself has won the International Acoustic Music Award. And it's doing pretty well already after just being out for a couple of weeks.
James Kahn, is someone who grew up learning to read by reading your books, it has been a high honor talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.